Philadelphia greeted Sylvester Stallone on a cool autumn morning. The air was fresh, the streets were lively, and the city, despite the years, seemed just as familiar to him. He stood at the exit of the airport, deeply inhaling the familiar smell of asphalt, coffee from roadside cafes, and the light aroma of withering leaves. He was wearing simple jeans, a black t-shirt, and a gray hoodie. He didn't want to attract attention. It was his personal day, when he could forget about cameras, flashes, reporters, and endless interviews. He just wanted to walk around the places where he spent his childhood and youth, to feel nostalgic, to remember what this city was like when he was just starting out. He took a taxi, saying briefly to the driver, "Center." Sitting in the back seat, he looked out the window. The streets he knew by heart flashed past, but they looked different now. The buildings were taller, the streets cleaner, the cars faster. But somewhere deep beneath all the modern details, the spirit of Philadelphia he remembered remained. The first stop was his old school. Sylvester got out of the car and stopped at the entrance. He remembered that facade, remembered those corridors he once walked in, dreaming of a movie, but not yet knowing how exactly to get into that world. He sat down on the bench opposite, folded his hands in his lap, and simply watched. Memories came flooding back to him. How he sat at the back of the class, drawing boxers and future movie heroes in his notebook. How teachers told him he should try harder, but he already knew his dreams lay beyond these walls. How his classmates laughed when he told them he would one day become a great actor. Stallone chuckled. Now everyone knew his name. The school doors opened and a group of teenagers ran out. Some were laughing, some were chatting on their phones, some were hurrying to the bus stop with a backpack on their back. None of them were paying attention to him, and that was exactly what he wanted. It had been more than 50 years since he had been one of those boys. He couldn't help but think how many of those kids were dreamers like him. He took a deep breath, held it for a couple of seconds, and then stood up. It's time to move on. He walked along the streets that led him to meet his memories. Here he grew up, here he spent his childhood. Here is the old bookstore where he once bought his first book about screenwriting. Here is the small cinema where he ran to the evening screenings. The facades of some buildings had changed, new signs had appeared, but the same atmosphere was in the air as decades ago. Sylvester stopped at one of the houses and looked at it with a smile. It was his old apartment, where he lived before fate turned his life to Hollywood. He remembered how in this house he first wrote a draft of the script for Rocky, how he looked out the window and imagined that one day he would leave this neighborhood and achieve success. And he did it. But now he was here again. The next stop was the park where he once trained. It was here that he ran early in the morning, it was here that he first worked on his fitness, it was here that he ran his first long distance, not yet suspecting that one day this run would inspire the iconic scene in Rocky. He walked slowly along the alley, enjoying the moment. People were going about their business. Someone was riding a bike, someone was walking a dog, someone was doing exercises. Two elderly men approached him, and one of them, squinting, said, "You're that guy. You're Sylvester Stallone, right?" Stallone chuckled. "Well, I was similar when I was young," he replied, shaking their hands. The men laughed. They didn't pull out their phones or ask for an autograph, they just talked to him in a friendly way. "We've seen all your movies," one of them said. "Dude, you inspired us when we were young. And you know what? You still do." Stallone smiled. "Thanks, guys. It means a lot." They chatted a little more, and then the men wished him luck and moved on. Sylvester remained in place for a moment, watching their departing silhouettes. It was still an important part of this city. But the day is not over yet. Ahead of him was the bar where he had spent Friday nights as a young man. And he didn't even suspect that this evening would bring him an unexpected conflict. Sylvester Stallone strolled slowly through the streets of his hometown, enjoying the cool autumn air. Life was in full swing around him, street vendors loudly offering hot dogs and coffee, cars honking at traffic lights, bright sun reflected in shop windows. All of this was part of Philadelphia, the same one that raised him, taught him to fight and not give up. His next stop was the park, which had been his second home in his youth. Here he trained, wrote his first scripts, and thought about the future. Now the park looked updated, new paths, well-kept lawns, neat benches. But the atmosphere remained the same. He went deeper into the park, to where he once ran early in the morning, inspired by his dreams. Here he practiced his punches, did exercises, imagining himself as a great fighter. It was here that he began to work on his physical fitness, not knowing that one day his image would inspire millions of people. He imagined young Sly in his shorts and tank top, and old sneakers that were starting to tear, running along these paths. He remembered how he sometimes had to work at night to buy himself some sports nutrition, how he turned down parties because he had to run every morning. One day in this park he collapsed from exhaustion after a long run and wanted to give up. But then he thought, what if I just get up and run again? And he did it. Sylvester smiled. This spirit, this desire to never give up, it was always with him. Stallone walked further and saw an old bench where he had once sat while pondering the script for Rocky. He remembered writing his first lines of dialogue, doubting every line but not giving up. He sat down, stretched out his legs, and thoughtfully looked around the park. There were two older men sitting on a nearby bench, talking about baseball. One of them glanced at him and frowned slightly. Look, Joe, I think I know this guy. The second man looked towards Stallone and narrowed his eyes. Oh, come on, Bill. You see celebrities everywhere. No, seriously. Just look at him. This is. Stallone grinned and turned to face them. You know, guys, I was also told that I look like Sylvester Stallone. The men laughed. You're a joker, boy, said one of them, slapping his knee. But seriously, you really are him, aren't you? Sylvester nodded. The men looked at each other. One of them shook his head. Oh my, he muttered. You know, Sly, we grew up watching your movies. We watched Rocky when we were young, and damn, we'd run around those tracks afterwards, pretending we were champions, too. Yeah, the second one picked up. You can't even imagine how many people you inspired. We all dreamed of being as strong as you. Sylvester smiled. He was used to such words, but each time they reminded him of the real meaning of his work. Thanks, guys, he said, shaking their hands. But you know, in life, it's not just about being strong. It's about being able to get up when you fall. The men looked at each other and then nodded. Damn, even in normal conversation you sound like you're in a movie, one of them joked. All three laughed. After a short conversation, the men said goodbye, and Stallone was left alone again. He looked at the track where he once ran and realized that this place would forever remain a part of his soul. But the walk down memory lane was not yet over. Ahead of him was an old bar where he had spent many a fun evening with his friends. And there something unexpected awaited him. As the sun began to set, painting the streets of Philadelphia in golden-orange tones, Sylvester Stallone headed to the old bar that had once been his second home. It was where he spent Friday nights with friends, discussing movies, sports, and life. It was a place where glasses clinked, friends laughed, and live music played. He walked down the familiar streets, taking his time. People, absorbed in their own affairs, ignored him, just the way he wanted. Unlike Hollywood, here he felt like just another guy from Philadelphia. The same as he had been all those years ago. A few minutes later he found himself at the right building. The bar looked almost exactly like it did in his memories. A wooden sign, slightly faded, but still recognizable. The same heavy doors that once swung noisily open, letting in guests. Stallone took a deep breath, then pushed the door open and walked in. Inside, the atmosphere was the same as he remembered. Barney, the owner of the place for over 40 years, was still standing behind the counter. Old photos of boxers and the local baseball team hung on the walls, and the old pool table was still in the corner. Stallone walked to the bar and sat down on one of the high stools. Barney glanced at him as he wiped his glass. "How can I help you?" he asked in his usual rude tone, not recognizing the visitor. Stallone chuckled. "Beer, Barney. Just like old times." Barney raised an eyebrow, looked at him intently, then suddenly froze. Oh, come on, he muttered, looking closer. Sylvester leaned slightly closer and added with a smile. Have you forgotten who used to beat you at billiards every evening? Barney's eyes widened, then he laughed and slapped the counter. Damn it, Sly. The bartender gave his hand a firm handshake. You haven't changed at all, friend. Although no, I'm lying, you've become even more damn cool. Stallone grinned as he accepted his beer. I'm just well preserved. Barney shook his head, still not believing that standing before him was a movie legend, the same guy who once sat here dreaming of more. So what brought you back? Nostalgia, Barney. Decided to remember my youth. The bartender nodded understandingly. You've come to the right place. Nothing has changed here. Except that the visitors have become younger. Stallone took a sip of beer, savoring its familiar taste. He truly felt at home. But this evening was far from as calm as he expected. Unexpected guests. About 20 minutes passed. Stallone sat, going over the past moments in his memory, when he suddenly felt a push in his back. He didn't pay attention, perhaps someone accidentally touched him while passing by. But a minute later the jolt came again. This time stronger. Then there was a rough laugh behind him. Hey, old man, do you even belong here? Someone said in a mocking tone. Stallone slowly placed the glass on the counter. He heard a group of young guys sitting at a table nearby. There were 4 of them, loud, self-confident, already quite tipsy. Are you deaf, Grandpa? Another voice said. We said it was time for you to retire. At that moment, a third push made him turn around. He slowly turned in his chair and looked at the 4 guys sitting a few feet away from him. They didn't recognize him yet. They just saw a hooded man who they thought was out of place. One of them, the tallest, with short blonde hair, grinned and said lazily, What are you staring at, Grandpa? Are we bothering you? Stallone looked at him calmly. He could have just gotten up and left. But he was not used to keeping silent when someone showed disrespect. And now they have chosen the wrong person to joke with. Sylvester rose slowly from his chair. The crowd behind the bar fell silent. Barney froze, holding his breath. Stallone calmly reached for his hood, and slowly pulled it down, revealing his face. The boys' faces changed instantly. The smiles disappeared, and in their place appeared bewilderment, and then shock. Oh shit! One of them muttered. The other one, who had called him old man a minute ago, froze with his mouth open. Stallone looked at them calmly, then slowly clenched and rubbed his fists. If you don't know how to behave, I can teach you, he said calmly. Barney chuckled behind the counter, realizing what was about to happen. The boys looked at each other. They knew who was standing in front of them. They knew Sylvester Stallone wasn't just an actor. He actually had martial arts skills. The one who first touched him quickly stood up. We didn't do anything like that. Yeah. We were just joking, dude, the second one muttered, swallowing nervously. Stallone didn't move. But his calm was more frightening than any threats. In that case, I think it's time for you to go. Yes, exactly. We're leaving already. One of them squeezed out. The guys quickly grabbed their jackets and, pushing each other, quickly walked out of the bar. As soon as the door closed behind them, loud laughter was heard. Barney slapped the counter. Damn, Sly, you still know how to instill fear. Stallone picked up the glass, took the last sip of beer and put it back. Some things never change, Barney. The crowd around laughed. Yes, he is no longer young, but he was and remains a legend. The bar was once again filled with noise and conversation. Customers were discussing their business, someone was ordering new drinks, and there was some soft music playing in the corner. But the tension was still in the air. Sylvester Stallone slowly sat back down at the bar, pretending nothing had happened. He picked up his glass and twirled it in his fingers, as if considering whether to take another sip. Around him, people were chatting animatedly, discussing what had just happened. Barney was still grinning as he wiped down the counter. Did you see their faces, Sly? He chuckled. As soon as you took the hood off, They nearly wet themselves. Stallone chuckled slightly, but his gaze remained focused. They are young, hot-blooded. They think that the whole world is at their feet. Barney shook his head. Yeah, well, until they run into someone like you. Sylvester put his glass on the bar and looked at the entrance. He expected the guys to just leave, but for some reason he felt that this was not the end. Barney noticed his gaze and frowned. Something wrong? Stallone ran his hand thoughtfully across his chin. I don't know. I just have a feeling that they haven't calmed down yet. The bartender wanted to say something, but at that moment the bar door swung open again. The boys are back. This time they were not alone. Another man came in with them, a little older, strong-built, with short dark hair. He was obviously their leader. Perhaps an older brother of one of the guys, or simply someone they decided to call for a talk. Stallone didn't move, just watched calmly. Barney frowned. Not in my bar, guys, he said, looking at them. But they didn't pay attention. The older boy stepped forward. So I heard you scared my boys, old man? He said in a rough voice. Stallone looked at him calmly. They left on their own. I didn't touch them. But you wanted to, right? He chuckled. The other guys looked at each other, gaining confidence. Now they felt bolder because they had with them someone they considered stronger. Barney pressed his lips together and placed the rag on the counter. Guys, I'm not going to tolerate any squabbles. If you want to fight, go outside. The older boy grinned. Relax, man. We just want to talk. Stallone looked at him calmly, but his posture was already ready for action. Speak. My guys said you wanted to teach them a lesson? Maybe you'll teach me a lesson too? The bar fell silent at that moment. Several people sitting at the bar were following the conversation closely. One of the older customers even moved his glass slightly further away, in case the situation escalated. Stallone sighed. Look, man, I'm not looking to fight. I just wanted to have a beer and remember old times. The older guy chuckled. Beer? Who needs you, Grandpa, with your old times? Do you think you're still a great champion? You're nobody anymore. These words caused a nervous laugh from someone in the room. Barney shook his head. You picked the wrong guy to pick on, buddy. The older boy ignored him. He stood right in front of Stallone, towering over him. But Sylvester did not move. His gaze remained calm, confident, cold. He wasn't afraid of this guy. He knew that the fight was won before the first blow was thrown. Last warning. I'll give you one last chance to leave, Stallone said calmly, finally rising from his chair. Now he towered over the boy. Everyone in the bar froze. Barney took his hands off the counter, preparing for what was about to happen. Are you threatening me, Grandpa? The boy chuckled, but there was a hint of uncertainty in his voice. Stallone slowly rubbed his fists, as if considering whether this was worth wasting his time on. I'm just giving you a chance. The moment lasted an eternity. Silence. And suddenly the older guy exhaled sharply, took a step back and said, Damn. Fuck you. We're leaving. The other guys looked at each other, and then hurried after him to the exit. As the door closed behind them, loud laughter erupted in the bar. Barney slapped the counter. Sly, you didn't lift a finger, and they already surrendered. Stallone sat back, took a sip of beer and said with a grin, Experience. The crowd laughed and the bar returned to normal. But now everyone who was here this evening will remember this moment. Because legends remain legends. The bar was filled with the usual noise again. People were returning to their conversations, someone was clinking glasses, the bartender was pouring another whiskey for a regular in the corner. However, a sense of tension was still in the air. Sylvester Stallone sat calmly at the counter, pretending that nothing had happened. However, everyone who witnessed the recent scene understood that they had just become part of history, even if not cinematic, but real. Barney continued to grin as he poured the drinks. I'm damn glad you've got the nerve, Sly, he said, pouring another beer and setting it down in front of the actor. Although I admit, I wouldn't mind watching you beat the crap out of those guys. Stallone grinned and took a sip. Barney, you know I'm not that hot guy who fought on the streets anymore. The bartender snorted. Come on, you could have sent them flying with one blow. Several patrons in the bar, who had recently been quiet, were now animatedly discussing what had happened. Did you see how pale they turned when he took off his hood? One of the men laughed. They thought it was just an old man in front of them, but in reality it was bloody Rocky Balboa. The second one chimed in. Sylvester did not intervene in the conversations, but only listened, calmly continuing to drink his beer. But suddenly the bar door opened again. Unexpected return. Everyone turned around sharply, expecting anything. Perhaps the same company had decided to return with even greater confidence, or even with reinforcements. But instead, one of the guys who had tried to pick on him earlier walked in. It was the same fair-haired young man who had first pushed Stallone. He looked unsure. There was no longer any impudence in his movements. He was more collected now, less defiant. Silence fell in the hall again. He walked up to the bar, stopped a few steps away from Sylvester, and slowly put his hands in his pockets, clearly showing that he didn't want a conflict. Sir, he finally said, swallowing. Barney folded his arms across his chest, watching the scene. Are you up to your old tricks again? He said rudely. The guy quickly shook his head. No. I wanted to apologize. Stallone looked at him without a single emotion. Continue. The young man sighed, clearly collecting his thoughts. I was wrong. We were wrong. We acted like complete idiots. I didn't recognize you right away, but even if I had, it doesn't matter. We shouldn't have done that. Barney raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. Well, no way. The young man continued. I used to think that I was cool. That I could say whatever I wanted to anyone. But now I realize that no matter who is in front of you, a famous person or an ordinary guy, you have to respect those around you. You didn't say it, but I realized it myself. He took a deep breath, then slowly pulled a bill out of his pocket and placed it on the counter in front of the bartender. This treat is on me. For everyone. A murmur of approval ran through the hall. Sylvester looked at him carefully. The guy swallowed nervously, as if expecting the final verdict. What's your name? Stallone finally asked. Tony, sir. Sylvester nodded. Tony, you've learned one important thing. You can be the strongest guy in the room, but if you don't respect others, you're nobody. Tony nodded silently. Sylvester picked up his glass, looked at Barney, then back at the guy. Sit down, Tony. You've earned the right to have a beer with Rocky today. The entire hall burst into applause. Barney chuckled and reached for another glass. Now I understand what a real lesson in respect is. The final chord. The evening continued in a more friendly atmosphere. Tony did indeed sit next to Sylvester, and his former friends seemed to have decided not to show up. The bar was back to the place Sly remembered, warm, friendly, filled with good people. When the clock struck midnight, Stallone stood up and headed for the exit. Barney called after him. Hey, Rocky, don't disappear, you're always a welcome guest here. Sylvester turned around, nodded, and said with a slight grin, It's always nice to come home. He stepped outside, took a breath of the Philadelphia night air, and continued down the road. The city has changed. The people have changed. But some things will remain the same. For example, respect, honor, and a legend named Sylvester Stallone.